Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Francis Creighton. I'm the president and CEO of the Wine and Spirits Wholesalers of America. Welcome to WSWA's 2026 Q1 SipSource subscriber session. We are very thankful to all of our subscribers, our data contributors, and everybody who's part of the SipSource environment. We continue to believe and know that this is the best industry data that's out there, and we're very proud of this product, and we hope that you're seeing real value out of it on a daily basis. This session is being recorded, so we want to make sure that everybody is aware of that. And we encourage you to send in any questions that you might have below us in the chat. Let us know if you've got any questions, and if anything big comes up, either I or my colleague Eric Schmidt, who's also on this call, will make sure that Danny and Dale see them. I'm going to let Danny and Dale describe everything, but what I would just add is that, this is an industry that I've been part of, not as long as these guys have been in it, for about 3.5 years. And what I hear a lot from people is, I really feel that something is going to happen, that they're using their gut to make decisions. And of course, what we have SipSource for is to allow you to have some real data to empower your decisions, so that we're moving beyond how we feel things are going, and we can actually see in real time, real world implications, and how the products are actually performing out in the market. So we're very proud of this product. And with that, I will turn it over. Before I turn it over to Dale, I'll note that Danny Brager is here, and turn it over now to our friend Dale Stratton. Dale.
Thank you very much, Francis, and appreciate the introduction and just really so much support what you spoke about there on fact-based decision making. So thank you for that. Today's topics, what we really want to dig in here is looking at some external factors that are impacting the business. Look at top line trends, but then we picked out three subjects that we really think are uh, making a difference in the industry right now and are worth noting that we're seeing in our data. And that's really around channel dynamics, shifts that are happening there, price and premiumization. And premiumization is such a hot topic. And, we've, as an industry, done so well for so many years on premiumization that is now under threat. We want to look at that a little bit. And then dig in on RTDs. That is still a growing part of the industry and really having an impact. And then we'll take a look at what we see coming up for the future in our future. The rest of 2026 really is what we're going to focus on in that area. So on external factors, uh, really difficult to ignore economic and geopolitical backdrop. There's just a lot that is happening. Inflation continues to, that cumulative inflation has a pretty substantial impact on consumer spending. Certainly, there's talk about the K-shaped economy and a lot of theories around that. But the net of it is that inflation and it being sustained is definitely impacting consumers. Also, just higher interest rates that have sustained. And we'll see what happens there if those do come down, if that's going to be a big change. But the net of it is that has had an impact on how people manage their money. And that really leads to this thing with tight inventory management. And while it's difficult to say that there's a big impact on people reducing inventory, we've reduced inventory. But I would also say the offset of that is that we're not seeing any growth opportunities with people starting to restock heavier inventories and maybe displaying product more and doing things like that. So that tight inventory management remains. Um, uh, I'm confused on tariffs. I wish I could talk about exactly where we are in tariffs. But certainly whether people are getting money, where tariffs are, is really, really difficult to say. But that has had an impact on the business and certainly at the supplier level. the situation in Canada has had an impact and is likely to continue to. Consumer changes, demographics, we continue to see a very large consumption group of people continue to age out at the higher end. Younger people with lifestyles and how they're living their lives, the health initiatives, the wellness initiatives, those things are all happening, and those are continuing to impact the industry. Uh, the competitive landscape remains brisk, certainly within beverage alcohol. We're going to continue to see that happen, but beyond beverage alcohol and products that are coming to the market that will replace a lot of occasions that would normally be beverage alcohol occasions, whether those are low energy relaxation occasions, high energy excitement occasions. We're seeing them come in, and certainly with the situation with THC based beverages and what's happening with that in that legislation, we're going to continue to see a lot of news around that. We would be remiss if we didn't speak about the route to market disruption. The transition of RNDC has brought about some disruption on all three tiers. Certainly on the supplier level, the wholesale level, and the retail level, that disruption is real. And then there's anti-alcohol voices, and we continue to fight against the anti-alcohol voices that are out there. And that's not going to go away anytime soon either. So, with that, Danny, why don't you talk a little bit more in detail about the economic factors?
Thanks, Dale. So I know that everyone hears this and everyone reads this. If you look at just the government published numbers, these are the consumer price index numbers that I plotted here, just a few of the different components. I've added in gasoline, given that that's obviously something that's caused quite a shock in terms of how consumers are spending money or have to spend money. The three different time frames I have here, going anywhere from the total CPI on the left over to on the right-hand side, beer, wines, and spirits. I chose December 22 because that was kind of the high point. If you go back a couple years in time, April 2025 was the low point, and then here we are in April 2026, a year later, and we've obviously seen inflation creep up. A few things to note. One is if you look at the very top, the away from home, so think of that as restaurants, bars, on premise, consistently is running well ahead of the at home CPI numbers, whether that's for food or whether that's for alcohol. And we're going to talk to this a little bit later to see that on premise, like relatively speaking, and given this is holding up relatively well, given all those price pressures. The other thing is that despite tariffs and all those other sorts of things, by the time product is getting to the consumer, we really haven't seen significant increases in the consumer price, like say at the shelf or um, uh, as you see these numbers, certainly not to the same level as what we're seeing for overall CPI or overall food. I suspect that everyone is fighting very hard to absorb price increases along the way so that we're not passing on price increases to the consumer, given that demand is challenged as it is, and we don't want to exacerbate the situation. So those gas prices, that 28.4, I mean, that's a pretty shocking number. We've kind of been here before. I think Dale told me that he tore through some old presentations and found something that a slide that I had put up. I think it was back in maybe 2008 during the recession. But you know, we've had other shocks, especially on gas, back to the early 2000s. The invasion of Iraq caused this. The hurricane caused Hurricane Katrina, and the Gulf Coast impact in 2005, the recession in 2008. I think the slide is from that period of time. And in 2012, we had a different crisis with Iran, along with Hurricane Isaac and Sandy and a couple of other things. So but we've got to recognize that people have to take care of their basic necessities, food, shelter, transportation, etc. And hopefully there's a little bit of money left over for products like we provide, but it's putting pressure on the consumer wallet. The other thing that may not get as much attention in the press as the CPI numbers, but the producer price index number is also published every month. The producer price increase, these numbers are measuring prices received by domestic producers for their output. So think of that as the raw material, wholesale goods, et cetera, et cetera. But often this is a foreshadowing of what could happen to the consumer price index if these input costs are then passed on to the consumer. And we've certainly seen that go up. The last reading of April 2026 was plus 6%. And you can see that blue bar in the far right-hand side is certainly well above where it had been for the previous few months. So this could be a foreshadowing that that consumer price index number that I showed on the last couple slides ago will continue to move forward. The other thing Dale mentioned about the rising interest costs and whether those will be maintained, as we're certainly not in those zero interest rates that we were a few years ago and likely won't be there again. But this is a long-term slide. Again, it's published by the Census Bureau. It measures overall alcohol wholesaler inventories, which is the red line, versus sales, which is the black line. And while those things had kind of marched in tandem with a pretty narrow gap for a long, long period of time, when we got to 2023, and there was an expectation that maybe some of the COVID impacted sales gains would continue, but that didn't happen, and inventory was relatively free, and that caused that gap to grow pretty substantially. So if you look at the gap between inventory and sales, that ratio is 1.61. It's very wide. We keep thinking it's got to come down or it needs to come down, and we're seeing some reductions. I was looking at the inventory levels, and this is across beer, wines, and spirits. They don't break it down by category, but for the last 3 months, inventory levels have been down in the 4 to almost 5% range for 3 consecutive months. So we are starting to see some reductions in inventory. At the same time, we're still seeing reductions in sales, so the gap is closing just a tad, but not a whole lot. So I think we'll look forward to seeing continued reductions in the inventory levels.
Danny, before you leave this slide, may I just
Of
ask,
course.
when I talk to wholesalers, they know what's in their warehouse. When I talk to suppliers and retailers, they talk about this slide, but they always ask me, is there any way to know what is in the warehouse? What is filling that inventory that's not going up? Why is this happening?
Yeah, I wish there was more. I mean, just in terms of the numbers themselves, I wish there was more further breakdowns as to, what category and so on. I personally don't think it's beer. Beer moves too fast, so it's likely not that. So I think it's more wines and spirits. I would guess it's more probably at the higher end, and I would look to categories or segments within categories that say aren't doing as well as they used to. Like, and I know Dale's going to talk about tequila at the very high end. Like it's slowed down a lot, but there's likely a lot of inventory that's out there that's just not moving as fast through the three tiers to the consumer. So I think we can guess it's what some of those things are. Obviously, individual distributors know their own situation, but Dale, I don't know if there's anything more you want to add.
No, and I think you hit it right. This is a revenue measure, not a volume measure. So that would lend us to believe that it is probably more high-priced things that are remaining in inventory. And Danny, we will talk about this on a couple
Yeah.
of fronts in a couple of slides on some potential changes there.
So the next slide we're going to show is kind of the poster slide, I guess, for the overall um, core spirits, and we're going to exclude RTDs and then come back to RTDs as we move through the presentation. But so core spirits excludes RTDs. That's the green line. The red is wine. The yellow, courtesy of our friends at the Beer Institute, is the gold line. These are all 12-month rolling depletion numbers going from on the far left-hand side, which is, think of that as 2021, over to the right-hand side, and that's through March of 2026. Um, and you can see that all the numbers are certainly below that solid black line, which is the zero level. Um, they're a lot lower, especially for core spirits, than they were back in the COVID days where we saw some very high levels of demand. Wine is trailing, but we will break that down a little bit because it certainly differs depending on what sort of price tiers, varietals, all those different segments we look at, because not everything is at that same level. And we did see, and I guess Dale and I were encouraged that we did see some improvement in March. I would color that with a couple things. One is there was an extra shipping day in March. Secondly, there was an earlier Easter this year than last year, so that probably played into it. So the question that we have is, that's encouraging because we love it when that line starts to change and it starts to go north. But the question is it sustainable? And I know Dale had the opportunity just to take a very quick peek at the April SipSource numbers, which are just available like just now, and probably has a comment on what we're going to see in it as we look at the April numbers.
Yeah, and turning to the top line trends, and as we move to that, this is for total wine and spirits. The blue line being volume, the green line being revenue. And to Danny's point, we saw a nice little uptick in March. Early April numbers will show that we're going to give a lot of that back. And the moving of Easter certainly played a big role in that, in addition to the extra shipping day. May of 2025 was really, really soft. So I think we're going to get some of that back in May. And then June, we get that shipping day back. So by the end of the quarter, I think we will be back to that slope heading back up in a north direction, and heading the right direction and showing some improvement for them in total. When we look at spirits, what we see here is, though, this depremiumization in the last 3 months, which has gotten pretty severe, with revenue numbers dipping way below volume numbers in trend. That's something, again, we'll talk about here in a few slides and dig in a little bit on that. Wine, on the other hand, went the opposite way, where we saw a big increase on the revenue side for wine, and the depletions that have gone in there in the first quarter of last year. Some of that going against pretty soft numbers. But the net of it is that we're gonna see a little bit of a bumpy ride here over the next 2 months. But we do believe that we will end up with a more positive direction on trends. We'll talk more again about that when we wrap this up. With that, Danny, why don't you talk a little bit more about the individual categories and probably start with pods?
Yeah, one of the newer facts and measures within SipSource is two different measures. One is the count sold, the other is pods, which is simply the number of items times the number of locations. And we've been looking at the trend. So these are 12-month pod numbers compared to a year ago, 12 months. And you can see that generally they're down, but it's better than it was. If I go back to 2025, we were looking at decreases of 5% roughly, averagely. So we're looking here at some lower rate of declines than we were before. So it's telling us that maybe that's starting to stabilize. At the same time, given the nature of the categories and the declines that everyone's looking at, including retailers, whether it be on or off premise, they're being very careful about which items are making it onto shelves, which items stay or are removed if they're not turning over. So I think we'll continue to see a whole lot of vigilance over assortment, how much space these categories are getting, which specific items get to the shelf or get to the menu and which don't. But these are better numbers than we had seen if we go back to 2025. So if we look at the spirits category, and here we're breaking it down by the different product classes. And again, these are just core spirits, so this does not include our RTDs for right now. We'll come back to that. The columns represent share of revenue in order from tequila over to the right-hand side, Irish whiskey. And then the blue dots represent 12-month numbers. These are all on revenue. So almost everything here is below zero. So we're seeing declines, but the level of declines differ by some that are not down all that much and some that are down much more significantly. A couple comments that we made just in the headline, while U.S. whiskey, you can see here it's minus 4.9, that's 12 months. In the current month, that was actually up a little bit. So we did see a couple categories that experienced that March bump a little bit more than other categories. The other one, on a more longer term basis, cordials has been faring better. Again, that minus 2.7 isn't in growth, but it's better than some of the other declines. And if I look specifically at on-premise, cordials over the last 12 months are actually up almost 2%. So that's been a pretty good segment within the overall spirits category. If we look at table wine, and again, these numbers are 12-month numbers. If you look at the blue dots, again the columns represent share of revenue. A couple things. One is that uh, white varietals are tending to do better than reds, and if I went into table white varietals even more so, we'd see things like Sauvignon Blanc and Pinot Grigio doing better. Sparkling category has held up pretty well. If we broke that down a little bit more, we'd see things like Prosecco, and I think Dale will probably talk to it, doing better than the sort of flat area. Sake has held up pretty well. It's up 1.3%. Cocktails, ready to drink cocktails and wine have held up pretty well. And these are 12-month numbers. Again, the March numbers saw that improvement. We'll probably give some of that back, or we will in April, that Dale talked to as well. And we're going to break down some of the dynamics on versus off that Dale is going to take us through.
Yeah, and starting with this, and Danny mentioned this, and we do find it to be pretty interesting in that knowing that the inflation numbers are really spiking in the on-premise much more, and that's been sustained, right? That's not anything that is new, but you can see over the 12 months that we're outlining here. This is on a volume basis, and this is wine and spirits combined, with the blue line being the on-premise, and the orange line being off-premise. That we've seen a big bifurcation, and we're really seeing this volume in the on-premise go. We do think that number one, consumers do want to go out. Consumers do want to get out, and they really, really do want to experience and have some experiences, be with people. We've got some great events coming up this year, this summer, that will drive that even further. So we're definitely seeing that. Now, I also think that there's a bit of an inventory thing here, right? The off-premise tends to buy more inventory, and will forward buy inventory, and will buy inventory for display. Where in the on-premise, there's just no space for inventory. So that's really kind of the ongoing business, and I do think that that is having some impact here. When we look at it from a revenue standpoint, the revenue has lagged volume a little bit on this, but the same story is here, and that we're seeing that happen, and that the on-premise is pretty significantly outperforming the off-premise. And Danny's going to talk a little bit about what that looks like if you break out wine and spirits separately.
So here we're looking at spirits revenue, off-premise sub-channels on the left-hand side, on-premise sub-channels on the right-hand side. And generally, as you go across, sort of from looking the left side, the right side, like Dale mentioned, the on-premise is doing better than the off-premise. A few different things just to call out, and some things aren't all that much different from what we've said or what we've seen for the last couple of years. Drugstores being, sort of almost walking away from alcohol to some extent, with some very large decreases. Uh, C-stores, while we're not looking here at gains, it's doing better than some of the other sub-channels in the off-premise. And then on the right-hand side, again, generally numbers are better than they are for off-premise. But what I thought was interesting, dining and bars, if I think of that as the major sub-channels within the on-premise, you can see around -4.4, -4.3, but the numbers get better when we look at some of the other sub-channels within on-premise, like recreation. Think of that as stadiums and concessions and things like that, or lodging. Think of that as hotels or other sort of on-premise sub-channels that aren't the main restaurants and bars. Those numbers are doing relatively well. If we look at the trend, and I think Dale put this sort of together on the same page just so we can really see, and this is for spirits, that the challenge really for spirits, and we'll see this sort of similar for wine, is really that those off-premise numbers are going down, and the trend continues to slope down. And that would be our major concern about the spirits category in the off-premise. On-premise is again doing better than that, the other concern that we would have, and Dale will speak to this on the premiumization side of things, that revenue is going down faster than volume. And that's something we really had not, if you go back a couple of years ago or even beyond that, we've always talked about premiumization. I think there's a big question mark there around that right now, given what we're seeing and all those economic pressures on consumers. These are the numbers for wine. Again, just some of the things are sort of similar, just at different levels. Drugstores being very weak, convenience stores doing better than some of the other off-premise sub-channels on the left-hand side. Then on the right-hand side, again, similar, sort of the channels or sub-channels within on-premise outside of restaurants and bars, like recreation, lodging, other on-premise channels are holding up relatively better than some of the larger channels within on-premise. Again, just looking at in trend, it's just such a really different direction. I mean, off-premise, you can see what that looks like. But on the right-hand side, the on-premise numbers continue to strengthen. And in this case, what's different about these numbers as opposed to spirits is that revenue is growing faster than volume. So to some degree, somewhat might say that the premiumization is there within wine. I think Dale will help us understand that it's not quite that, but we'll come to that in a second or two.
Good segue, Danny.
Yeah,
Thank you.
really.
Right into price and premiumization. And this is for those of you who receive the monthly report, the chart that you guys see every day. Looking at spirits, the blue bar represents volume share by price tier. The green bar represents revenue share by price tier. And then we've outlined the trend from a revenue standpoint with the square. And we've seen good improvement in this 20 to 29.99 and 30 to 49.99. So that 20 to 50, that's getting better. There was some peaking that we saw the under 13 where that was getting better. It's leveled off a little bit. But really the big story here is what's happening at the other end. The over 50, those two segments over 50 are really very much in decline and are seeing very, very big losses. And if we look at every price tier and the blue bar being volume, the green bar being revenue, and the trend on those over the last 12 months, we can see that every price tier is actually depremiumizing, that the revenue number is performing worse than the volume number. So that is widespread, and it really is kicking across every price tier. And you can really see, though, how severe it is in the over 50. So I wanted to do just a little bit of a thought process and dive around those two price tiers. And so I went right to the tequila category. We've talked about tequila and what has happened. That was such a reliable growth engine. And for many, many years, it was doing so very, very well. And it was doing very well at the high end. And we saw significant premiumization, where now what we see here, certainly at that area, that those price tiers are struggling. And I liked using the tequila category here, one, because it was a growth engine, but also in those tier 5 and tier 6, tequila represents 58% of the total revenue in there and 66% of the total volume that occurs in those two price segments. So it is so significant in what's going on there. But then you see up there at that top that the under 13 is near flat and really not losing much steam. People probably trading into that 20 to 29 area that we're seeing positive trends on, and how that is going and what that looks like. So I think this is indicative of what's going on in the lack of premiumization, and it's going to be very, very difficult for us to believe that we're going to see the premiumization come back in the short term. I think it's something that is going to endure for a little while, especially if inflation remains like it is. And then it made me think about what does in that over 50 what does share of revenue look like versus share of points of distribution? And so the blue bar here representing share of pods, green representing share of revenue. Interesting to me when I get down here to the middle that tequila really isn't over skewed. That the revenue per pod is really very strong across almost all of the tequila. Certainly silver and reposado, very strong. On the other end of this, man, it feels like bourbons over $50 are vulnerable. Account for 22.3% of the points of distribution, and are only accounting for 11.3% of the revenue. If you look at that on an on-off split, it's very similar. It doesn't really move much and doesn't really change. So it feels to me as though points of distribution in the bourbon category are likely pretty vulnerable. Of course, this is going to be done on an account by account basis. Turning to wine, and we've talked about this, that, we're seeing poor performance at the lower end, better performance at the higher end. And that would lead you to believe that the category is premiumizing when we think about table wine. However, if I break this out and I look at it by individual price tier, so volume is down 9 for the total category, down 6.3 for the total table wine category on revenue. But all of that is really happening at that under $5 place, where I see that volume is far outstripping revenue in that area, and it's such a big area. Those are big losses. But when I get down here to these higher end areas, volume is actually performing better. We're seeing discounting that is occurring at the higher end wines as supply remains long. The harvest last year ended up being much bigger than what people anticipated that it would be. And so far, the growing season this year, while early, is very healthy, and there's really been no issues to believe that there's going to be anything other than a regular growing season for those high end wines. So while the top line number says premiumization, if you dig down, table wines really are not premiumizing. Did that same exercise, pods versus revenue by price tier. I don't think there's any real big news here other than that low end feels as though it's probably still a little over skewed, and there's still room for some skew rationalization down there. When I look at sparkling wine, this feels more like premiumization. You can see just how strong really that 16 to 19.99, that is driven by Prosecco. And the revenue and the volume numbers are very close together. But I do see down here at the higher end in those two high price tiers that revenue is outpacing volume and doing better there. So I think that this really does look as though that some good things are happening within the sparkling category, continuing to do well in this latest 12-month rolling period. Same exercise with pods, and I know there's a lot of flavored products that are coming into the sparkling category. A lot of different things are happening, mostly under 15. But that would be the place that I would think would be most vulnerable, where certainly that 16 to 19.99, where Prosecco lives, revenue continues to outstrip. Those are just high velocity items and doing well. So that was a little view of what we see happening in premiumization. We'll see what happens with table wine. If it comes back a little bit, spirits unlikely to really move on premiumization in the near term. With that, we're going to have Danny talk about RTDs.
So RTDs ready to drink. I guess I would first start off by saying there's a lot of different adjectives about this as I think about it. It's kind of a nuanced segment. It cuts across beer, wines, and spirits, depending on how you define it or how some define it. It can be a bit blurry, certainly a bit chaotic, a lot of churn. I'd also say it's pretty exciting, at least to some. Some love it. Certainly consumers seem to like it. I'm not sure everybody, depending on who the everybody is, if they all feel the same way about it. But if we take sort of the longer, bigger picture view, and what I'm looking at here, and I'm using some data from our friends at Nielsen, partly because some of these products move through various distribution networks, not all just a pure wines and spirits distributor. So this is a broader view of the RTD category specific to on off-premise here. And if we define these RTDs as sort of these ready-to-drink products that tend to be smaller containers, sort of single-serve type containers, whether it be malt-based, wine-based, or spirits-based. And all I've done here is go back to 2020, 2021 and look at the trend of malt-based RTDs, which is the dark blue, wine-based, which is the medium colored blue, and then spirits-based, which is the top one, the lighter blue. And look at the trend. Certainly the spirits-based RTDs are the ones that it's where all the growth is right now, or almost all of the growth, although there's wine cocktail growth on a smaller level too. That those spirit RTDs are now 3.5 times larger, that 3.6 billion compared to 1 billion back in 2021. The growth has not slowed down. I personally thought it might have slowed down. If I would have said, someone would have asked me that a couple of years ago, that has not been the case. If anything, growth rates are accelerating. That 30% for the latest 52 weeks is now closer to 40% on a year-to-date basis. So there's been no slowdown. And that is now a very significant part of the overall spirits category for sure. If you put everything together, though, RTDs overall are not growing to a large extent. There's some growth, but you can see the declines in the malt-based flavored malt beverages and hard seltzers, basically malt-based, are down considerably versus where they were. So there's some trade-offs across RTDs depending on the base, and not that consumers necessarily care about the base all that much. I'd say they're more choosing by brand and cocktail type and so on, but there is interplay between all these categories. But these categories are large, and if we again just specific to the off-premise, these are the scan numbers. I've shown here the percentage of the wine category, beer category, and spirits category that are RTDs, and the number, just the eye-popping number to me, is that 28% of spirits in the off-premise are accounted for by RTDs on volume. That's a much lower number on dollars, 11%, still large, but nowhere near the 28%. So there's likely some implications to that, to margins and so on. But again, 28%, that's larger than any of the traditional vodka, whiskey, gin, rum type categories. So huge in size. And then within that, there's just all kinds of change all the time. I see brands that grow really, really quickly and then decline just as fast. And this is a representation of within prepared cocktails. And in this case, I'm including both the RTD spirits cocktails as well as the larger spirits prepared cocktails, like a 1.5, for instance, is in here as well. But if we look at brands and the top 15 brands in each of 2021 through to the latest 52 weeks ending middle of April, um, there's been lots of change. The latest 52 weeks, there's 9 of those top 15 were not in the top 15 in 2021. That's 60% of the top 15 has changed. There's some clear leaders that have emerged. So if we look at, say, High Noon, Cutwater, Buzzballs, and Surfside, you're getting up to about over 50% of the category in those top brands. But like I said, there's lots of churn. These brands are changing positions every time, every month when we look at the numbers. So if we kind of summarize, at least for spirit RTDs, there's just lots of companies in it. There's beer companies, wine companies, spirit companies that are now almost redefining themselves as beverage companies, but they're all playing in this RTD space. Consumers seem to love them generally, certainly the spirit-based RTDs right now. I'd say the industry, depending on who we're talking to or who you are, some love them, some not so much. I'd say there's certainly cannibalization if we look at the impact of these on the core wines and spirits category. There's certainly trade-offs as consumers forsake sort of a core product and buy an RTD for whatever reasons they have, whether it's flavor or format or price or whatever. Top brands still dominate, probably even more so. The top five or 55% of the category, the top 15, you get over 80% of the category, but there's well over 750 brands now just in the scan data. And then there's just all that churn and change. So it's difficult to manage with lots of hits and lots of misses. I mentioned about the changeover in the top 15, but even within the top 50 RTD spirits brands, half of them are declining, and 60% of those half are declining at double-digit levels. So it's hard to keep on top of trends that are changing that quickly. I would just say as more and more brands enter the category, each should really ask themselves about why is their RTD different than what's out there already. And in terms of facts to gauge progress, you should look at not just trial, but what's the repeat rate look like, and not just sales trends, but what's the sales velocity or the sales rate look like. So exciting category, pretty chaotic, but it is the one that's certainly fueling, certainly within spirits and to some degree within wine, the growth right now. So let's talk about what's ahead, Dale.
So as we look ahead and what's happening, all I've done here and really just looking at the comps that we're facing. So each of these are individual 3-month periods. We close. This is for core spirits, so spirits without the premixed cocktails. So we closed the first quarter down 5.1% on volume, down 6.7% in revenue. And as we look at this, you can see that for the next 2 quarters, really not soft comps, that we're not facing soft comps. We do once we get to the fourth quarter. So have to believe that there's going to be some continued challenges for the spirits category based on comps as we look forward for the next 2 quarters. Again, as we said earlier, given to give up a little bit in May or in April. May probably will be a little bit better. June, better yet. So that by the end of the second quarter, I think we'll have a good number with trends at least improving, but it's going to be a little bit more challenging on the spirit side of things. When I look at the wine category, less so. That especially on the revenue side, that the headwinds we're facing are much lighter when you look at the comps and what's happening within the wine category. So we would expect over the next coming months here, the next 2 quarters, that we would see wine improve probably at a faster rate than we do with spirits. Mostly, and again, on both sides, but probably a little bit more on the revenue, even though those volume comps are pretty stiff. The in general, like, we believe that 2026 is again going to show improvement. We're not likely going to get back to growth. We're not going to get back to growth. I would say I can say that pretty confidently. But those are the headwinds and those are the items that we're facing and what that looks like. So with that, Danny, why don't you kick us off on some final thoughts?
So Dale, you mentioned a couple of minutes ago, like we're not going to see growth, and I would agree with you. I think that we will continue to see these negative trends again outside of premixed cocktails. I hope that based on both the comps that you talked about and some other factors that, including if you go down to number five, we've got some major potential upside events that might help us through the year, that we should see some easing of the level of declines. Again, I would emphasize that I don't think that means we're going to grow. I just think, as we saw in March, like the line starts to move better. The line starts to slow up a little, starts to slope up. That's what we would hope to be able to see through the balance of 2026. The pressure is going to continue to be very intense on all three tiers of total beverage alcohol. We didn't talk to DTC, but don't assume that DTC looks any better. We looked at certainly for wine where DTC activities, there's lots of it, but they're under similar pressures. In fact, within the DTC category, for wine, the only thing that's showing some growth is really the luxury side. Everything's almost under $100 is not growing. It's declining pretty significantly. Volatility will continue. There's still route to market disruptions that, all the tiers are going through and having to contend with all of that, and maybe taking some focus away from really bearing down on on the consumer, but instead trying to sort out all the route to market issues that need to be sorted out. Inventory management, I don't think interest rates, given the current inflationary environment, are likely to come down anytime soon. We'll see what the new Fed chair has in mind. But that will continue to be top of mind. The economic and geopolitical, I call them both the realities of what we face now and the uncertainty of what that could look like a month from now, 2 months from now, 3 months from now is still, the uncertainty will remain, and consumers are wary, and they're not going to spend money without knowing kind of what things might look like now and down the road. Um, and in view of all that, the industry is adjusting. They have to adjust. There's company downsizing. There's the trends that we've seen on the number of suppliers, whether it be beer, wines, or spirits that had been growing are now declining. There's more transactions and collaborative partnerships. There are some that are just saying this isn't working and they're winding things down. And then, within that RTD space, there's going to continue to be a lot of activity and churn, M&A activity, et cetera, because that is the one growth area, certainly again on the wines and spirits side. And then we talked about or I had mentioned the major upside events, whether it be the World Cup or the 250th birthday, that hopefully we can leverage to have consumers enjoy all those events along with their favorite glass of wine or spirits. Um, and that will be a good thing. Although Dale and I were talking yesterday that if that is a good thing, that's great. Then then in 2027 we're going to have to measure ourselves against 2026. So we'll have to come up with another set of major upside events, I guess, to even things out. But I'd say, Dale, I've sort of chatted on for a bit, but anything to add to these thoughts?
I don't think so. Again, I think that you really hit it well there. I do think, when we've seen things in the news with large spirits companies talking about partnerships, and there's just going to be a lot of creativity in that space, in people trying to find solutions and moving forward, and what does their business structure look like. So I think it's going to continue to be an active year in that area. And to your point, we just got to leverage the events and those positive things that are coming our way in the near term to get all we can and grow the business. So with that, thank you very much for attending.
We do have a few questions, Dale.
Yeah, if I
Beautiful.
could, we got a couple of questions in here. Where does beatbox fall on the in our classification?
Wine cocktails.
Wine cocktails, but not the RTD list. Or is it an
Uh,
RTD, but
it would be in the RTD wine cocktail list. Yeah.
Yep.
gotcha.
And
Okay. And
and
then
uh,
sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
How much cannibalization is happening with spirit RTDs from malt-based, and how much is spirit RTD growth coming from other categories, i.e., traditional beer and table wine?
I don't have the exact numbers. I mean, I've looked at some of the consumer numbers, and there's like if I look at spirit RTDs, and I can't remember the exact split, but there's considerable cannibalization from, say, hard seltzers for the malt-based things, the White Claws, Trulies, and so on of the world, um, as well as vodka for the main part and tequila. Like, and you think about RTD cocktails, they're largely vodka-based and some, a, another segment of tequila-based cocktails. And when people are drinking those, especially at a moderate price point, there's cannibalization against, a core vodka or a core tequila. So it's both.
Eric Schmidt, runs a SipSource product for us here at WSWA. Question from somebody: When will this deck be shared?
Yes, the deck will be shared with all of our contributors and our subscribers.
And when do you do that?
right after this. We'll get a
Excellent.
recording of it.
Soon.
We'll send out a deck. We'll send out the deck, and we'll send out a link to the recording of this, so you have it for future reference.
Thank you, Danny. Dale, when do you think we should start seeing World Cup movement in product? Because the World Cup games start a month from now. So should we be seeing it in May, or do you think it's all going to be in June?
I think you'll start to see some of it in May. I think you'll get some lead up on that. People are going to be building that out. I think it will be interesting to see which categories benefit most from that. These are obviously very, very big beer sponsorship events. But I do think, when you think about RTDs right along with the beer category, they're going to do well, and it will translate to all categories. But I think we're going to start seeing that hit pretty early. There's a lot of excitement around that.
And you'd think, we were talking about on-premise doing better than off-premise generally. That should continue. That should continue to accelerate that. I mean,
Yeah, I'd also note, by the way, that Diageo is an official sponsor of World Cup. So, of course, they do more than just beer, but obviously they do spirits more. But that's an interesting point. Another question from somebody looking forward. Can you explain why we expect headwinds for wine to be lighter than spirits when the percentages are more negative?
Yeah, because we're going against more easy comps. So when I go back to that, my current negative is much closer to what I'm going to be facing. As a matter of fact, so I'm already on the revenue side. My decline is already better than what the forward look view is. Where when I go to spirits, on both of these, my current performance is well below the two coming quarters.
yeah, I just think of it as kind of the larger the negative that we're comparing against, the easier it should be to beat those numbers. But
Yeah.
All right. Well, last call for questions. We have nothing in the question list. So last call. Are you Dale or Danny? Oh, you're going back to this slide.
If you do have any further questions, please feel free to send them to Danny and I directly, or to Eric and or Francis, and they will get them to us, and we can answer those questions for you.
Well, thank you everybody for attending today. Like I said, the contributors and subscribers will get through our Axios group, we'll get a link to the recording so you can share with your colleagues, and also the presentation deck. We appreciate your time today, and take care and be well.
thank you very much. Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.